Morning, everyone. So I thought what we would do is have a little discussion, really about what Labour can do to beat populism. We know that or they've said anyway, whether you know or not, they have said it's one of their priorities. And there's like three groups of things. There are things that Labour before the election had already said, because it's not like after the riots, populism is a bit of a problem. We hadn't realised. Everyone had sort of realised it was a problem anyway. And so there are things that Labour had already said that they were going to do in the manifesto, or they'd made an explicit statement before the election. There are things that since the riots they've said they would do that they may have already planned to do anyway, but they have nonetheless announced since the riots, which means may or may not have planned to do them, but at least they are now. And then there are things that they could probably do that they haven't said anything about, which means potentially that they won't be doing anything, or that they just haven't mentioned it yet. And I'll start off with actually David Faulkner's 15 Hong Kong dollars, first of all. Thank you. It says, combat global bigotry. The global stuff may be trickier because by definition that you need a global response for that. So that would be working internationally. So that'd be more David Lammy's job. Although in terms of one of the things that Labour had said before, there's actually quite a list. If you think about what feeds populism and what you need to deal with it. And Labour are actually very explicit. It's actually quite interesting because in the wake of the riots, when they started up, Keir Starmer wasn't keen. Actually, I could understand why, for various reasons. He wasn't keen on specifically tying in Nigel Farage with them. And yet he's more than happy to describe Nigel Farage as the driver of populism in the UK and someone who needs to be countered. And and one of the, in terms of global issues, one of the things that David Lammy talked about before the election even, and saying one of his priorities will be tackling, or the Labour government's priorities will be tackling kleptocracy. What they mean by that is the massive levels of money laundering that goes on in the country. And that, you think, how is that linked to populism? That's just organised crime, isn't it? You have to think about where a lot of the funding for this comes from. You know, there's funding for even some simple things like Reform UK. We don't know where their funding comes from because they take lots of money from like PayPal things, which could come from out of the country or wherever. We don't know where it comes from. But in terms of the infrastructure that was needed to organize these riots, I mean, they coordinated a lot of attacks with relatively small number of people, really. When you consider the number of people involved in the riots of 2011, which covered fewer cities, and you look at now, which covered more places but fewer people, and it was all coordinated. They got these groups of people to effectively like overwhelm the police in certain areas and cause a lot of destruction with relatively small numbers of people, a lot of places at the same time over a number of days. That was quite sophisticated. That required a lot of build-up, and it required a lot of funding. Where did that funding come from? You know, there's already a former member of MI6 saying there's clearly Russian links here. So we're talking about foreign money. So dealing with kleptocracy actually would also help deal with some of the effects of the problems with populism that we have in this country. Captain Bard Roberts saying about critical thinking. Well, that's in the Labour have just announced plans. So I did a video on my own channel actually about that last night from a teacher's point of view. So Bridget Phillipson has announced that critical thinking will be taught in primary and secondary schools, which is like, it should be huge news. That should be absolutely massive news. It's something that's been sorely needed. I've said for many years, many people have said for many years, we need critical thinking taught in this country. However, I am just going to pour cold water on it and just say my bitter experience of there's never been a real initiative to teach critical thinking on the scale that Bridget Phillipson is currently talking about. But it would probably fall into the same category as similar initiatives on other soft skills. And I've seen how it works in education. And do you know what? If she does it in the same way they've tried lots of other things, it's not going to work. So I'm actually going to say I'm really happy that that is going to be government policy. But I'm also going to say, unless she's aware of, because she's not a teacher, and that, which is fine. But unless she's aware of the problems in education that would make, because what happened, okay, to put it in a nutshell, without me going over that video, you can check it out on my own channel if you want. In a nutshell, what happens is when you're in teaching, I've been in teaching over 20 years. When I was a young teacher, what would happen is you'd get this new initiative, this new government initiative, all sounded very exciting. And older teachers would tell you, yeah, this is nothing new. We've had this before. And it goes around in cycles. Once you've been in teaching for a while, you see this so-called new initiative is not a new initiative. What happens is you get an education secretary in and their band of merry advisors. They go, oh, we've read this paper, this great thing. Oh, this would be brilliant for education. We should do this. They go, yeah, let's do this. And they go and do it. And because they think, Billy's saying I rubbish critical thinking yesterday. I did not rubbish critical thinking. I rubbished the way it will probably be implemented, which won't work. Critical thinking is essential and we should teach it. But the way, if they do it in the same way they've tried before, it won't work. What happens in education, so they get this idea, they push it out there, but because they don't understand how education works, it fails completely. And then it gets dropped. And then what happens in 5 years' time, you have a new education secretary, new group of advisors. They read this paper. They go, oh, this is brilliant. This is the latest thing. We should do this. And because none of them ever knew anything about education before they moved to that department, they think it's a new idea and it's not. And the teachers just look at them going, here we go again. And they do it in the same way as well. They do it in the same way because they think it's a new idea. The fact that they think it's a new idea means they'd had no idea what's going on. So what I'm saying is it's absolutely essential that we do teach critical thinking. I'm very pleased it's going to be government policy. It is one of those things where you don't really reap the rewards for decades, though. So this isn't something that fixes it quickly. This is a long-term thing. But at the same time, unless the Department for Education explain or even know how it's, if they try and do it in the same way they've done other things, it won't work. We will not actually get it. Anyway, that is something that Labour have only just announced. In terms of things that Labour had announced before the election, which means they've already got plans set up. So one of the things that feeds populism is, of course, perceived or real poor living standards. And we do have, actually, it's not just perception, we have poor living standards in this country. They keep talking about, we're one of the richest countries in the world. And it's like, well, in terms of GDP, but in terms of the actual living standards of people in this country, we're actually like barely in the top 30. Ivan Ambrose, 499 super chat, thank you. It says, surely electoral reform and press media reform is more paramount than ever now. It is, although I would say strictly in terms of populism, electoral reform wouldn't deal with it. Press reform would, and media reform would. That is on my third category. And then number 3, £2 super chat, thank you. Says, find out what works elsewhere, then copy that. See, that's exactly it. So they do teach critical thinking in, say, Finland and Denmark. So what should happen is the Department for Education should go there, go, what did you guys do? Or what works? Or what lessons did you learn? And then we should use those. But we should still review it, because what works in one country may not work in another. But that should definitely be a starting point. Do I think that's what the Department for Education will do? Do I, Eckers like? Anyway, in terms of the list of things they'd already announced. So in terms of living standards, Labour had already talked about improved access to decent housing. Obviously, if you think about the populism we're talking about, there's lots of types of populism, of course. But in terms of the populism that's a particular problem in this country, it's very much anchors itself on anti-immigration sentiment, sometimes anti-multiculturalism as well. There's had been a lot of that feeding through with these riots, which is there is crossover. There are people, obviously, if you're against diverse ethnicities in this country, you're going to be against immigration, but it is possible to be against one and not the other. So they're slightly separate, but they are both issues. So, but if you ask people about the immigration side of it, which is by far and away, like, there's only a minority of people who don't, a small minority at that, who don't like an ethnically diverse Britain, but there's way more people who are worried about immigration, right? So in terms of the immigration, which is the bigger issue in terms of perceptions, what are people's actual issues? Oh, well, it stops us getting, we don't have enough houses for the immigrants. So if you have enough houses, then it's not an issue. And then they'll say, oh, it's stopping us getting decent jobs, which we know is not true. Facts, but again, that's a perception. But if people can't have that perception, so if we not only generate more decent jobs, but also make sure that pay is better. So Labour have specific plans to make sure that people's pay increases in real terms over the next few years. That will also help. You improve access to public services. Another one will be going, well, you can't get an appointment with the GP. Again, I mean, people will say, oh, there was like this uncontrolled immigration under the last Labour government. But it's like, okay, so if you're going to say, well, first of all, it's never true. There's no such thing as uncontrolled immigration anywhere. But if you're going to say that is the fact, how do you explain the fact that it was really easy to get a GP appointment when Labour were last in power? And how was it much easier? Like if you were burgled, for example, the police would be around. Whereas now that's not so much a thing. How is that a thing? Alistair Kerr there, £2 super chat. Thank you. Finland is the way to go, in my opinion. Mine too, but again, that's what needs to happen. If you're gonna introduce something new, and we've never done this in this country, we've never taught critical thinking as a sort of government strategy. The only people who have critical thinking skills in this country are people who've, such as myself, who will have learned them either from some like adult figures who took the time to try and teach me, but also university. University is a pretty good place to pick them up. But in terms of actually teaching them to the whole population, it's never been done in this country ever. The Conservatives don't like it. And actually one danger is, even if Labour get it right, if we let the Conservatives, and that's where the electoral reform comes in, if the Conservatives come back into majority, they will scrap it immediately. And it will be immediate. It'll be in the very first year, it'll be instantly scrapped. Because the last thing they want is that. Other things that Labour had already talked about, rebuilding the criminal justice system. Obviously, you don't want a perception that we haven't actually got room to put nutters in. Fixing the asylum system. I mean, that is necessary. Asylum's like tiny. The asylum system should be tiny. The numbers should be absolutely minuscule. And if we remove the visible signs of it, like, the hotel accommodation, the small boats crossings, there isn't really much of a handle to get on asylum. They'll still try, but it doesn't work on enough people if it's not visible, if you have a decent asylum system. And although they do, I will say on this, it's like a 50-50 for me. Labour have plans to deal with some of those issues with asylum, but there are also other things they need to do to really deal with asylum that they haven't talked about. So we will see if they do it. But at the end of the day, if in a few years' time, the small boats problem has either gone away, preferably, or at least is in like savage decline. And if we're not using hotel accommodation or anything like that for people who are claiming asylum, if we're managing the situation as a combination of like improving access to housing, but also clearing the backlog and setting up safe routes. That's I know Labour aren't really talking about that, but that they've whispered it. But that is absolutely essential, because you don't stop the small boats without that. That's got nothing to do with the backlog. That's entirely about safe routes to claim asylum. So if we do get rid of those visible signs, that dies down a lot as well. Akko Dave saying that if people had stability, security, and a good standard of living, they might start to think for themselves and stop fighting each other. Leaders never allow this. Well, that is the issue, ultimately. For Conservatives around the world, their basic plan is to force the majority of people to fight each other over limited resources. They take all the... It's really as simple as this. This is Conservative politics around the world. This is how the right wing exists. They take all the resources themselves and then leave the rest to fight each other over the scraps. In a nutshell, that's how Conservatives work around the world. And we must absolutely stop that. Frank Imosa, £5 super chat. Thank you. Perhaps that's why the former government was trying to encourage fewer people to go to university, reduce people critical thinking. It is 100% the case. The other thing as well is sometimes, Lizzie, that's a very deep way of thinking of it, and that is absolutely the case for some of them. For some of them, it's much more like guttural, really. So there was the way they think about it is much less deeply in a lot of cases. They just think to themselves, I am paying for my kids to go to private school, so I don't want state schools teaching their kids as well. It's all about their own offspring, their own kids' opportunities. Sometimes it's as simple as just being selfish for their own kids. I want my kids to have the best start in life. So part of that is like sending them to private school and getting the best education so that they can get a jump ahead. But part of it is holding others back, dragging others down. So they support reduced funding for state schools because their kid doesn't go to a state school. That's why they scream and shout about this VAT on private schools. So it's going to cost them more. And they go, if I can't afford it? Well, maybe you shouldn't have supported poorer resourcing in state schools, because there's no reason why state schools shouldn't be able to offer the same quality of education as private schools. In fact, Bridget Phillipson was going on about that. There's an article today in The Guardian where she's talking about this gap between private schools and state schools. So so some of them, it is literally just they want to avoid others going to just because they want to give their own kids the best possible start. But in terms of those who think more widely about it, yes, they want to reduce opportunities. It's like the old Tony Benn thing. These conservatives, they want the population to be just about educated enough to operate the machinery of the state to do the work, but not smart enough to question what's going on above them. But there you go. Snowy Cat saying, so I was taught critical thinking at high school in the 60s in English lessons via newspapers and ads. Pass this knowledge on to my kids. All four of them are lefties like me. But I mean, even they're not. I mean, you've got people on the right wing that have got critical thinking skills. It's just, you need, very few parents will have them, which means very few parents will actively teach them to their kids. Even some who do have them may not actively teach them to their kids. And, there you go. It's, but so you are leaving it and there's no, there's no capacity to teach it in primary and secondary at the moment. You'd need a fundamental reform of our education system. You can't just say, teach critical thinking to schools. You need to actually fundamentally reform the way we teach things in general. But anyway, those are the plans that Labour had already announced before the election. So the ones they already had in mind. And Keir Starmer, even before the election, when he was talking about populism, did very much put the emphasis on standard of living. There are some things that Labour have announced since the riots. They've announced a review of the Online Safety Act. Because even when that came out last year, people were saying it doesn't really go far enough. And in some areas, it's a bit dodgy. And so it was never considered a great thing. And I'll bet you the same thing happens again. It is complicated. The problem we have with the Online Safety Act mostly is up until that was passed, and most of it's not been implemented yet, the legislation we were relying on to police social media came from 1986. And that's ultimately the problem we've had. We've allowed the we'll have had MPs of Labour and Conservatives, because we're going back 40 years here. Labour and Conservative governments have just not kept up to date, and they've not kept the law up to date. So yeah, when you're reliant on 1986 legislation to police social media, which didn't exist then. So then what's happened is we had a particularly incompetent populist government last year trying to enact some legislation which was needed, but inevitably it ended up not being that fit for purpose. And I'm going to actually say, although I've got greater faith in Labour, I'm going to say what ends up coming out of this review in a few years' time probably won't be good enough either. Because there's this, I might have mentioned it once or twice, there's this fundamental disconnect between government, that means senior ministers, the politicians, but also senior officials and advisors, who just seem to have no idea how it works. But they've announced it, so that's good. They've also announced specifically engaging with social media companies in order to work on ways to make sure that they are taking down harmful content more quickly, more proactively, which you could argue they're sort of, there's a lot of dovetailing there, because that could also end up being in the revision of the Online Safety Act, if there is one. But teaching critical thinking in schools, we've done that. Also building up police structures. Now, some of you may have noticed. So when the riots first hit in Southport, and Keir Starmer gave his, and then we had the other ones the next day, Keir Starmer gave that emergency press conference. He had that emergency meeting with police leaders, and then he gave the press conference. And one of the things he talked about, I forget the exact word, what was the words now? But he talked about having set up this special policing unit, right, to deal with it. And there were lots of people go, well, what's that about? In fact, cheekily, there were some Conservative MPs go, well, what does that even mean? What does that even mean? And what it meant was, so back in 2011, for the riots in 2011, we had this where policing was better resourced because the Tories had only been in power for a year by then. So it was basically still Labour's policing legacy. And there was a coordinator, there was a police chiefs group, which allowed senior police leaders to deploy wherever needed during national emergencies. So actually, when we had the riots in 2011, the policing was much more effective in the end, largely because we had that sort of coordinated structure, that command structure. But it was completely obliterated, didn't exist for these riots. So when Starmer says he's created this unit, what he actually meant was we've re-established the unit that we had. But the reason why he didn't make, because you could argue, why didn't he make a political point? Why didn't he say, back in 2011, we had this thing, the Tories abolished it, so now we're recreating it? And I think the reason is, I think two reasons. First of all, he's wanting to make the point he doesn't want this performative politics. But secondly, one thing that Labour absolutely could, or the government absolutely did not want to say while the riots were going on, is the Tories have massively knackered our prison system, our criminal justice system, like CPS, policing system. He didn't want us to talk about the massive weaknesses in policing, prosecutions, court system, prisons, because that doesn't really support your argument that we're going to go after you, we're going to arrest you, we're going to put you in prison. So he needed to give the impression that the police force, the criminal justice system and prisons were all in really great shape, even though clearly they were not. So I think that's why I didn't make a point, but that's what he meant when he talked about, creating this new unit. He was talking about basically re-establishing. I mean, it may have some differences, but effectively re-establishing something that already existed. One angry pagan there talking to someone else saying, no riots here apart from in Plymouth. It was outnumbered by anti-racists. I'll be safe here. Most places were like that. That was the thing. I mean, one of the things that's been called for is a review into the riots in terms of where they took place and where there are vulnerabilities. Some of them would have just taken place in cities just because it would get into the news. Some of them took place in areas where they thought they'd have a good supply of local thugs. But it is worth looking at which places were targeted, where violence did flare, and which places were completely fine and were always going to be fine. One of the interesting things to look at will be, and again, this alludes to the coordinated nature of it, is if you're thinking about, well, wouldn't the easiest marks be places where there's a lot of support for this anti-immigration sentiment? In which case you have to ask yourself why there wasn't a single, unless I'm wrong, unless someone's going to correct me, I don't think there was a single flare-up of violence in any constituency with a Reform UK MP. Now, why would that be? Again, alludes to the coordinate. And I'm not saying it was coordinated with Reform UK. I'm not suggesting that Nigel Farage or Richard Tice were part of the group coordinating the riots. I don't think that. But it is interesting that given that there would have been a ready supply of local hooligans to take part if they wanted to make an issue, it is interesting that it didn't actually happen in those areas. And Nova's there saying they're not going to crap on their own doorstep. Well, that's it, you see, isn't it? Even though I completely believe that there was no explicit involvement from Reform UK MPs in these riots, they see themselves as on the same side. That is why when Nigel Farage had a pop at Tommy Robinson, all of those sort of people came out attacking Nigel Farage. Why are you attacking Tommy Robinson? Why are you? Oh, I was a supporter of yours, and you're now attacking our Tommy. You know, they didn't like it. They see themselves on the same side. It's almost like a sort of IRA Sinn Féin thing, where it's like, you know, Reform UK are seen as the political wing of the I don't know what you want to call it, the Tommy Robinson. Like we keep, if I mention the EDL, people go, oh, the EDL doesn't exist anymore. And it's like, well, technically no, but it was started by Tommy Robinson, who's still doing his thing in the same way with the same people. You know, so it technically may not exist, but it sort of does, if you see what I mean. But anyway, so those are things that Labour have announced since the riots, basically reviewing the Online Safety Act, looking at ways of getting social media platforms to take down harmful content more proactively, teaching critical thinking in schools, building up police structures again. But there are things for which there's been no announcements that are needed. Someone mentioned it right at the start. Media and press reform would definitely be needed because the way GB News in particular pushed misinformation during the riots was abhorrent, absolutely abhorrent. But even in terms of the more sort of responsible, I use that as a relative term, media, over the years, if you look at how it's built up, they have platformed people with anti-immigration rhetoric and allowed lies. It's different. It's one thing if you're going to argue against immigration, that's fine, but you shouldn't be able to say something that's objectively untrue and have the media present that without saying that's actually bollocks, by the way. But also, they're still doing it now. Even though they've dialed down the hate speech in there was an article in the Telegraph recently, but it was still saying, but Labour are going to need to deal with the issues of immigration. It's like, no, the issue isn't immigration. There's a perception that the issue is immigration, but the issue is not immigration. The issue is that people are being told that it's immigrants' fault that you don't have enough resources. When in actual fact, the reason you don't have enough resources is because of people like the owner of the Telegraph, who are nicking those resources, don't even live in this pissing country. The other thing you could argue that Labour need to do, and indeed some grandees in Labour have argued, Margaret Hodge at the forefront, that they haven't mentioned yet, but hopefully they can nudge this, is making the positive case for immigration. I don't think there'll be any signs of that in the short term, but hopefully that is something that can emerge. That needs to happen. And although I talked about David Lammy talking about the kleptocracy, because that is going to be a major source of funding for the organisation of the various groups who are pushing a lot of this information, you could also say part of that, and a very specific part that needs to be treated separately, would be dealing with, which has not been dealt with by the previous government, but should be by this government, the Russia report. We do need to tackle the influence of Russia in our politics. Oh my God, massive super chat. Hold on. I'm just going to check I haven't missed any others first. No, I haven't. Right. Ivan Ambrose, £50 super chat. It's utterly ridiculous. Thank you. It says, another vital area needs to be sorting out the housing crisis, particularly addressing the difficulties for first-time buyers and tenants. So again, that comes in the first lump. That was the very first thing I said. Labour do have plans for that. Remember, one of Labour's policies is that new house builds, first-time buyers get first dibs on them. So if there's a first-time buyer wants to buy a new house and they can pay for it, or they can get the mortgage for it, and they're up against someone else who isn't a first-time buyer, the first-time buyer gets it. I mean, obviously that's not in law yet, but that is one of Labour's policies. And tenants, obviously they've had, there's some legislation passing at the moment which will also help tenants. NIMBY culture must stop. Well, we know Labour again they say they're determined to ram NIMBYism out the way. Not all, but too many established property owners have an "I'm all right, Jack" attitude. Yeah, absolutely. And Labour have said they're dead against this. I mean, I noticed in the latest news today, the headline: English councils poised to get powers to buy greenbelt land without overpaying. So where compulsory purchase orders are used, that they pay what is considered a reasonable amount of compensation to the owner of the land, not getting completely stiffed. So there's all sorts of things that Labour had already announced that are coming through that will actually address those. I'm not going to say, oh, it'll all definitely work, because first of all, I'm not an expert. Second of all, I always warn others, particularly those who might, find certain populist leaders who are not always on the right quite appealing. It's one thing to have a policy that you think is good. It's another to be able to implement it. I mean, we've had competent governments in the past, Conservative and Labour, who've tried to do things and it hasn't worked out even in the way they envisaged, because even competent governments can still fail. Some things are very, very difficult. They're either politically difficult or legally difficult or just administratively difficult. When I talked about the difficulty that Bridget Phillipson will have in introducing critical thinking skills teaching into schools, if she's not aware of the difficulty, she's likely to fail. And it's not because her policy is bad. The policy is very good. But if she doesn't have a realistic plan for it, it will fail. It doesn't matter how competent she may be in a holistic sense and how good the policy is. If you have the wrong plan to deliver it, it will fail. So I don't know that all of this thing will work, but I do know that Labour are, in particular in terms of those sort of things, the housing crisis, they're on it. They are absolutely all over it. The fact that they're going really quickly with it, because you can tell what their priorities are. They've gone very quickly with dealing with water companies, housing crisis, and workers' rights. So the sort of workers' rights legislation that's also going through. So by the end of this year, we should actually have started. Because actually, that's the thing. Just talking about the rights there before I finish off. There's loads of people going on the right who now don't like the fact the police may come knocking because of the disinformation they've been spreading on social media. Oh, Labour are using all these dodgy new laws. It's like there's no new laws. Labour haven't passed any laws. They haven't passed any laws. They don't have time. They've introduced some bills to Parliament, all of which predate the riots, so have got nothing to do with this, and none of them have been passed. So the laws in place at the moment are the laws that are the result of 14 years of, hundreds of years of legislation, but 14 years of the Tories going, yeah, that law's fine, we'll keep it, or new laws that they put in themselves. They're all Tory laws. So if any right-wing nut job finds themselves in prison for spreading disinformation on social media, they're in prison because of a Tory law. Really that simple. Or a law that the Tories approved of, no matter who passed it. But as the Tories have been in power for most of the last few hundred years, it's probably a Tory law, let's be honest. But there we go. Wanga Pagan there saying Labour have allowed 6 new Badger licenses when they promised there wouldn't be any new licenses. Really disappointing. I didn't actually know that. It is disappointing. Is there a way to complain about an MP thinking recent incitement activity by Tyson Farage? I mean, the thing is, not really. Well, yeah, you can write to the Standards Committee if you think they're bringing Parliament into disrepute, but if they'd have to be doing something that sort of, it's not really, because it's, you can write to the Standards Committee, that's about it. That's really all there is to it. But in a lot of cases, MPs are going to air different views. We may think some of them are abhorrent. They may think some of ours are abhorrent. Unless the Standards Committee think there is something in the sort of rules of engagement, so to speak, that they're breaching, not a lot will happen. But in terms of complaining about an MP, you've got 2 options. You can complain to the party if you think that MP is acting contrary to party policy. But if you don't, if you just think they're acting in a generally scurrilous way, you can write to the Standards Committee, the Parliamentary Standards Committee. That's basically it. If you think they're breaking the law, you can write to the police, of course. They're not immune to prosecution. But there we go. Bouncy camera. It's bouncy mates because it's on my desk. I am actually now putting serious consideration into. I need to have a better setup for doing this. I've just got limited room, but I am going to look into that. It's one of my next jobs. But don't be surprised if it takes like me a month to find out exactly what kit I need. But we're going to leave it there anyway. I've got to go off to the shops and try and find some fresh fruit, because you have to go shopping twice a week these days to be able to have fruit through the week, as well as a few other nice things from the Morrison's Deli. But we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. Don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, I'll see you later.